Yeah, okay. Hello and welcome everyone to our second webinar. It's part of a series we're hosting looking at human-centered security. On today's topic, we're going to be covering why tackling the people component is so hard. As you realize, after all the effort and resources dedicated by organizations to securing themselves, the ITL still reports that when security breaches happen, 9 out of 10 of them are due to human factors. So what we're going to be doing today is, in this webinar, we'll be speaking with 3 guests about why tackling the people component of cybersecurity is hard. We'll be getting their perspectives on what their organizations are doing to tackle this, and how we can take learnings from psychology and cyber psychology particularly to help us understand how to create better policies that work for human behavior and not against it, or sorry, work with human behavior and not against it. So what's going to happen next is that on your screen, a poll should pop up. Okay, so when the poll pops up, I'll introduce my guests while the attendees fill in the poll. So, as I said, we've got 3 guests today who I'll introduce as you complete the poll. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, our guests, please type them in the Q&A and we'll address them. As you can see from the agenda, we'll have audience Q&A near the end. Okay, right. Okay, so to introduce my guests, firstly we've imogen Verrett, who is the Security Awareness Manager for Vodafone Group. Prior to this, she was the Senior Security and Assurance Manager in Cloud and Hosting at Vodafone. And prior to Vodafone, she served 17 years in the British Army, specialising in security and intelligence. So this should be an interesting discussion. She's got a broad background ranging from tactical analysis, training, information operations and strategic alliance. And she served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Hawaii, which she says was far the most beautiful. Her background is she has an academic background in zoology and developmental behavioural modelling. And apart from that, she loves cross-country, boxing and horse riding. Welcome, Imogen. Then we have Kerry Jones. Then we have Kerry Jones, who's a security researcher at RBS, where she's bringing people-centered approach from research into practice. So this would be nice to hear from Kerry around what's happening there. She's got over 10 years experience working in cybersecurity, where she spent most of her time in government in the UK civil service, where she researched people-centered security, understanding the needs of people with particular attention on improving security messages as well as security awareness campaigns. Having recently moved from central government, she now looks to bring that experience into the private sector. Harry. And then finally, we have Dr. Phoebe Asquith. Dr. Phoebe is a senior research associate in cyber psychology and human factors at Airbus and Cardiff University, where she works within Airbus's cyber innovations team in partnership with the Welsh Government. Phoebe's got an MA in psychology from the University of St Andrews and an MSc in cognitive neuroscience from the University of York, and finally a PhD from Cardiff University. Her thesis was developing novel neural network mapping techniques using FRMI, MEG, and machine learning. She's held various positions as research assistant, associate working on projects interested in human behavior, perception, and cognition. Her interest in psychology is rooted in understanding the relationship between security communication, awareness, and behavior, and the disconnect between the 3. She's got particular area of interest in explainable AI, cybersecurity visualizations, and communicating uncertainty and risk in cybersecurity. In her research, she uses EEG, eye tracking, and biosensors to collect objective data and inform cybersecurity information and interventions. Welcome, Phoebe. Okay, so hopefully you've all had a chance to fill in the poll, and we can look at those results later. So I'm now going to swiftly move on to sort of the question and answers with my guests. But before I do that, I just want to give them an opportunity to sort of introduce themselves. So, Imogen, how did you get involved in in security?
Partly by accident, to be honest, Shawful. I said I was looking at
like many of us.
many of us. I mentioned to two friends that I was looking at leaving the army, and then through various networks, I was approached by Vodafone and offered a job working in the cloud and hosting side. I didn't have a technical background, but I had a strong background in security and intelligence. And Vodafone said, actually, what we're looking for is some stronger leaders to come into the business. And that's how I ended up in Vodafone. After about 8 months, I then saw another job working within the security awareness team, which was much more down my road in terms of my skill set and experience around behaviour, influence, and trying to change cultures. So I then applied for that job, and that's where I am today. So quite a change from the army. But in many ways, there's lots of things that do connect across because it's all about people.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And Kerry, how did you get involved?
So I had no plan really to get into security. I started doing web design, IT support for like the NHS and private companies. I used to create the annoying screens that people read off when they cold call you in call centres and things like that. But what that gave me is I was very distinctly aware of how people use IT, and I was always interested in that sort of area. And then I happened to become unemployed during the financial crisis and decided to go back to university, and I did a master's in information security and privacy in Cardiff. And my dissertation was, I chose to be in storytelling to raise information security awareness. And that kind of obviously sparked my interest, but that was years ago before cyber was actually a known word. It wasn't a used word at all. It was still information security at that point. So I didn't know what to do with that, and I ended up being in a security operations centre for just shy of a year, where I happened to meet somebody who said to me, actually, I think you'd be really good working in the central government, and you should apply. So I did, and that's where I ended up for 8 years, and I happened to meet a person there that looked at understanding people with regards to security, very much at the beginning of my career in that workplace, which is pretty much what I did for the entire 8.5 years, which has now led me into RBS. So it was definitely not planned, and was never my intent, but it's where I've ended up, and very much what I'm passionate about now.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. And Phoebe, how about yourself?
Hi, thanks, Shawful. Yeah, it's really nice to hear Imogen and Kerry's journeys, because again, mine's really different, and like both of them, it wasn't a planned route. It's something that has become of interest, and is obviously an area where lots of people from different backgrounds and with different skills need to come together. So my background, as you mentioned earlier, is in cognitive and visual neuroscience, and during my PhD and placements.
Oops. I think we might have some issues with you're back, Phoebe. Sorry. We just lost you for a bit, Phoebe. So.
Oh, okay, sorry.
You were just saying you're interested
I guess a lot of... So I use naturalistic stimuli. Oh my God.
Okay, we can hear you now. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah. Naturalistic stimuli within my work. That meant lots of these, and it made me very interested in how to apply my research in the field rather than in kind of laboratories. I had the opportunity to join the human factors research, which chat with lots of people in industry, and I realised there were lots of gaps in cybersecurity research, and I was able to apply skills in new ways within this area, because there was a big lack of research in human-focused aspects of cyber. Okay,
well, thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Okay, so shall we start with the questioning? Okay, so I'll pick on Imogen first. Okay, Imogen, do organisations like Vodafone have the right balance in using technology to keep people safe versus educating people to stay safe?
I think within Vodafone now, the technology changes in the last few years have been immense. We've had a new CISO come in, and the transformation work that she's done has just been phenomenal. Bringing in the report phishing button, bringing in banners, bringing in a whole host of technology infrastructure to make our emailing and spamming vastly more secure, plus the various amounts we've been doing now on the vulnerabilities. So technology-wise, as a business, we're doing incredibly well. I think on the education side, we're now playing catch up. I think we're actually in the process of reviewing our mandatory training. And looking back at what we produced a few years ago, it was fairly, try and be careful now how we say this, just probably a little bit basic, not terribly engaging. And so what we're trying to do is bring in the science of learning, the science of imprinting, in order to try and make what we're doing on an education basis not just about informing our employees, but also trying to get them to emotionally engage with security, making it relevant to them, making it personable in a way that they actually want to engage with the education side of it. And the other problem that we've got with the education is the pace of change. And so just recently, what we've seen with COVID, so probably over 90% of our employees are now working at home. That creates a very different context. It creates a very different context for risk. And so what we're having to look is, what extra education do we need to give our employees now working at home that matches the context, but also the external threats. We're seeing a rapid increase in COVID-based phishing attacks and a whole host of other approaches. And I think the big challenge we have in education is twofold. First of all, making it interesting, engaging and personal. And the other problem that we have, or problem but a challenge, is keeping pace with the changes that we have. And trying to get that across an organisation of 100,000 employees is a real challenge.
Thank you. Thank you, Imogen. So Kerry, just following on from that, I mean, in terms of education, do you think organisations are utilising awareness training in the most effective way? And does it actually keep them safe from threats?
So it depends, as many things do in cyber security, because there are many different people that concentrate on awareness, but awareness means different things to different people. And so in actual fact, I've met a lot of people that do a lot of awareness training, like Imogen, who are extremely open and want to do more innovative things. And there's the possibility that they can, because their organisations are more open to it. But that isn't always true of everybody, because there's realistically, what does awareness mean to people? And is it awareness of just the fact that you need to be secure and you need to follow a rule? Or does awareness encapsulate more to do with the processes that exist within organisations? Can people really do the security tasks that you're asking them to do? And how do you actually bring that more holistic view across what awareness is, where it links to in an organisation, and where it can really have impact? Because if you're just looking at the idea of training a person about one particular aspect of cybersecurity, well, in actual fact, if they try and then do it and their process or their policy gets in their way and creates a blocker, there's only so far a person will get. And so that's where the effectiveness can be affected, because it's actually a lot more complex than people imagine. They think that perhaps if you just change a message here or you change a message there, then everything will be okay and you just need to take on that information. But actually, it's the complexity of understanding and relating is also about understanding the people on their day-to-day job, of whether they can actually go through those tasks, whether they can fulfill those tasks in a relatively straightforward manner, and to make sure that you're not building them up to fail. So they do all that they can, they want to take part, they want to do security in a way to keep the organisation secure. But then if they are coming up against things that they can't deal with, how do you then build that confidence in people that they can deal with problems, that they can ask the sorts of questions that they need to be able to ask, and to have a very honest and straightforward conversation, which I think is often where a lot of the awareness training just fits in the training element, but actually that there's a lot within that training, and it isn't then just for one member of staff or all the members of staff. It's also for the security professionals themselves to understand what people need. So it's across multidisciplinary approaches within an organisation of what awareness training is and who is it for and what are you trying to do with it, really, because you can't just look at one element of it, because you'll only ever get a very incremental add-on in an organisation if you're looking at it from that perspective. So yes, you can keep people safe, but it's probably not what your entire endeavour is, and you have to be aware of that incremental change and the time that it will take to do that as well.
Okay. Thank you. And just following on that, Phoebe, then, do you think from a sort of psychology perspective or human behaviour perspective that education and especially as Kerry was saying, that there's different remits for security awareness. What is it meant to deliver? Can it help people stay safe? Can education help people stay safe? Or are we as humans just wired to behave in an irrational way, and we can't manage risk?
I think education is of massive importance in addressing how we cope with risk. We're continually managing risk in our everyday life, but I would also say that we don't necessarily need to equate education with purely rational decision making. So we know that non-rational decision making is wired in. If I touch a hot pan, I have a reflex. If I'm crossing a road, I've got habits. I look both ways, and I have biases when I'm making decisions. And education can provide the tools to support rational thinking, things like knowledge, being able to step back and take time to consider an option, and that is useful when considering novel risks or high-level risks. But I think that education can also do a lot to combat or address and sometimes embrace the non-rational aspects to decision making. So helping people to reform habits, to become aware of biases, and to also change the direction of biases. So we know that if people are aware that others around them are acting in a certain way, and they're more likely to. So making education a sphere within which they can become more aware of that type of thing, or become aware of a leader acting in a certain way, because we know that if somebody of influence is acting in a certain way, people are more likely to imitate that behaviour. So I think we can also use education to tap into these non-rational aspects. So things like increasing the sense of personal threat to cybersecurity, not just the knowledge of the impact it might have on a company, but making it personal to a person. So they do bring this emotion, they do bring this kind of self-driven motivation to act in certain ways. And education should also always be supported by things like culture within the organisation and human-machine interfaces, because we can't ignore the non-rational. We just need to support it within our staff members' decision-making.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's quite interesting, because then I guess, if education or awareness training is not going to, or is not the full solution, Imogen, do you think companies are going in the right direction in addressing the people component? Are they giving it the attention it's due, or is it still just more security awareness training?
I can't really talk for any other company, Shawful, apart from Vodafone. But I think, yeah, certainly we are changing our direction now. And one of the big things we're doing is, yes, keeping doing the awareness training, mandatory training, weekly articles and what have you about the recent changes in the threat. But more importantly, we're starting to map the risk behaviours across the business. So we're going to look at objectively things like your DLP scores, your shadow IT scores, and then going back to the team managers of those various teams and saying, hey, these are your scores, this is how your team's performing. Please, can we come in and start engaging and doing various workshops? I think when you push out generic training generically across a business, you're not going to get the response that you want. So what we're doing is going a level deeper now, going to find the measurements, record them, monitor it, but more importantly, go back and share that information with the team leaders themselves, because that's where we start to encourage greater accountability for security, but also much greater visibility. It's all very well saying to people that we need to reduce the amount of data that's leaked out of a business, but until you give a manager the scores from his team, it just doesn't mean anything to him. It's a risk, it's out there, but he's got all the demands on a daily basis that the managers need to cover. And so the big thing that we've started doing with my wonderful team is building this baseline and starting to actually get the metrics. And in doing so, it's given us much greater visibility. We can actually see the problem, and then we can engage and understand why. So in effect, we're able to accurately diagnose, why is this team doing particularly badly with DLP? Why is this other team having a high number of malware infections? And we can understand the why. When we understand the why, we can better engage. And so I think that's a big change that we're starting to do, is actually going into the data and then having a personal engagement with the teams, which will make a big difference, because also it changes the way they perceive security. So we're not this faceless organisation. We are real people. We're there to help. We're there to support. And if we can change the way they perceive security and the meaning they hold for security, they're much more likely to engage with us. So this is quite a big change that we're seeing with Vodafone.
Okay, it's really interesting, because I think obviously when you look at the data, you sort of understand what people are doing, and you're able to then relate to that. So Kerry, I mean, you know, sometimes, I mean, I analyze a lot of data around what people do, and you know, people always quote that, you know, people are going to do stupid things, they're the weakest links. What do you think about statements like that? Do you think they helpful? Do you think the risk that people pose can be measured accurately?
I definitely don't like the term that people are the weakest link, or that they're the wetware, or even the human layer, mainly just because I don't think it really doesn't help people engage with those that they're trying to help. So what we often see, especially in cyber, is that there's always this language of us and them. It's either the staff member that is not doing what I want them to do as a security person, so then they're the weakest link, or there's an attacker and they're trying to attack us. So there's always this negative phrasing around the way that we try to engage with people, and the language that we use then gets embedded in the way that we consider the problems going forward. It then biases and makes us ourselves think of it in that way, instead of coming from it from a completely different direction. It isn't always that just because I do one thing in one way and somebody else does something in another way doesn't make either of us wrong, realistically, because context in cybersecurity is really important. Is that actually it's coming together and understanding how to compromise, and actually what are the levers and where can we learn from each other? Because in actual fact, when you say things about people being the weakest link, it's like giving the impression that there's a true answer in cybersecurity, and that is rarely true in actual fact, because it might be, as I've said before, it might be about a system not working and they need to do things in particular ways. It could be that you have legacy systems that you can't just change, so you can't have the security that you would expect in that way. So how do you deal with that? And you have to have quite an open and approachable mindset to have that empathy for that situation, basically, and to be able to do that well, you have to stop thinking that, well, if they just do this one thing, if they just do things because it's easy, like you wouldn't believe how long a conversation I can have around the idea of updating. Updating, for example, seems like it's straightforward, but actually when you dig into the idea of how to update, who's updating, how much control you have about updating, it's not actually a straightforward thing for people to do. So actually there's a lot more nuance around, and if we understand that complexity more and understand that it isn't a fight, it's about coming together to make things better as a whole, and to work as a group. And as Imogen has said, working to understand why do people do the things you can do. So you can use baselining as a starting point to guide you. And then you have to think to yourself, actually, a lot of people, though, just like figures. So what do you do after that fact? Is it then that you just look at those metrics all of the time, but that doesn't then continue your learning? How do you build in that continuous improvement element into your work, which is why measuring the risk is quite difficult, because, well, what is a measurement? Anything can be a measurement, but what is it that people expect? What is it that people want, and who are those in your organization wanting these measurements? And they also have their own levers, they also have their own predisposed ideas of what it should be. But again, it's thinking about that interconnectedness, as I mentioned before, where people work, what they're trying to do, and how they want to engage, and building that as well into ongoing measurements, because we can't get stuck in the idea that you can just baseline. It's where do you go next? How do you build into what you're doing, and where do you go to next, so that people appreciate that measurement can be qualitative. It's perfectly fine to have qualitative feedback. That's just as useful as a number on a page. A number on a page is just as subjective as somebody saying something out loud, because lots of people will say, well, it's just somebody else's opinion, but a number that they filled out on a survey is just somebody else's opinion also that you've collated in a easier perhaps to manage way, but it doesn't make it more true. So following up, like Imogen has mentioned, to start with like that, but then how do you go forward is also really important.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, it is then quite interesting that if we are talking about, measuring, I mean, Phoebe, do you think there's a disconnect between then how security is communicated and then how people react to risk? And would that impact how we're not able, I guess, to measure it, or not measure it with one metric?
Yeah, I think there is a disconnect. We know that awareness of a problem doesn't always change behaviour. We know that training and campaigns don't always change behaviour. In order to be able to pull apart a problem, as both Kerry and Imogen have said, we need to map out the problem, create these metrics, and have something to work from. We need, as staff members, people need to understand why something is risky, why it's important. They need to have that knowledge through the communication that they're exposed to. They need to be able to glean that knowledge and also have a sense about why they should care about the threat. Because I think people react to risk based on their own priorities, and we need to really tap into that in the way security is communicated. I think most people get a lot of their security communications through the media, which can often be sensationalized or give people a sense that this is something that happens to a large company, it's not something I need to worry about. When information is communicated at work, it can often be seen as an IT problem, or if people have low commitment to their workplace, they don't kind of internalize that threat as something that they care about, something they want to do anything about. So I think, yeah, I do think there is a disconnect, but I think if companies can increase that sense of value and do more to make the staff members see why it's important to them, and make the information accessible. So sometimes the language that's used or visualizations that are used might not be appropriate for different people across the workforce. So being really aware of that can help a higher connect between security communication and response to the risk, I think.
Okay, well, thank you. So, I mean, Imogen, I mean, do you think organisations like Vodafone understand the scale of the problem? I mean, are you able to measure and understand the scale of the problem, or is that something that is a way in the future?
No, I think we do have a good appreciation of that now. Just taking some of the metrics that we do have, just using certain Microsoft tools to look at shadow IT, looking at DLP, looking at incidents of phishing and our simulations, just taking those 3 different data sets, I think they give us a good indicator of people's competence towards security, what they understand about risk, and how much they care as well. Also, just looking at things at how employees manage their own SharePoint sites, how many are kept private, how many are kept public. If you take all of this data together and you put all these layers across the business, you can quite easily get a good idea as to those are the teams that maybe have issues and those teams that need less attention. I think the next stage that we haven't yet got is the ability to bring all these different data sets together to create like a layer of different data sources to then get an overall picture. I think that's what we're working towards at the moment, whereas all the little data sets are siloed. So you have to look at them almost individually. We are running a project with our BI team where we are bringing those data sets together and we're starting to collectively map it. On top of that, then doing more sentiment analysis. And I think understanding why people do what they do, understanding employees' attitude towards security is as important as understanding the objective metrics as well. Because if you don't understand why people do what they do, as I said earlier, it's very difficult to elicit a change. And the other thing that we're looking at is, someone mentioned earlier about security awareness needs to be accessible. It needs to be accessible, it needs to be relevant to the culture of a country and a particular group. We've got 22 different countries in Vodafone. Some of these strategies that might work in India or Egypt, if you try to impose that in Germany, would never work. And so you've got the added complexity of understanding your different target audiences, mapping the risk in those individual countries, and then understanding the response that's going to work best with those particular people. And so this is, security awareness, security is very much about understanding your people. You've got to have a background in psychology and behaviour. It's technical. You need to understand the technical, but I think more than that, you've got to understand people. And that's where I think all of us have got a degree of psychology, behavioural background, is probably why we've ended up in the jobs that we're in.
Yeah, because we're interested in what people do and why they do it, I guess. So Kerry, I mean, are there, in your opinion, sort of successful approaches to tackling the people component? And do you think, probably just from your experience, how widely are they used?
Yeah, so I do think that like I said, there is a lot of creativity out there. It's just that people don't see it. So I think, especially around understanding people. There are groups, don't get me wrong, but you have to know the right sort of people to get into them, where people can discuss and have very open and legitimate conversations about how difficult it is, shared experiences and what have you. Because often what you see and what you how can experiences when you go into an organisation or when you speak to other organisations, it can be just sometimes about doing a survey to understand culture, but actually there's a lot more than that, and that is understood across that community. But then those higher up in an organisation often don't see the amount of resource that's needed and the amount of effort that needs to go into place to create a whole programme of work, because it takes time. And again, one thing I would say is that it's also taken a lot from just trying to constantly think that people need help, but in actual fact a lot of people bring a lot of resilience to your own organizations, because these processes, policies or what have you haven't worked for them for many years. Job roles are constantly changing, they're never static, yet policies are often static and processes often are, so people then will fill in their own gaps. So what we need to do is learn and understand how they're really doing their job. What is the real landscape of the organisation's workflows? How does information pass between departments, especially very large organisations, to understand actually where are those blockers? Where can you have real impact? And the way that you do that is through like listening, creating dialogue, and really truly listening without assumption of what you're already going to hear, to know that actually there's a lot of positivity. Organizations aren't dying all over the place because of cybersecurity incidents. Often there is one person that knows how to press a button that stops something from happening, but how does he know that? Where has he learned that from? And how do you pass that on to other people to make sure that that idea of tacit knowledge isn't just in one person's head, that you then are able to pass that on to others? And appreciating people for what they bring, I think, is what adds the success into this sort of area, instead of seeing them as seeing them as people who we just need to change and people we just need to push information to, is involving them into what work is going on, having their actual feedback and doing something about the feedback that they give you, and building that into the process of whatever analysis and whatever checking you're doing, to make sure that it actually is fit for purpose. And I would say to people in my team and people I would speak to, is that security is very territorial. So for example, we will force the use of terms like multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, which are always used in different ways, and they are different, of course, but not most people don't understand how they're different. So why do we get so caught up in what we call things and what they are to others? And so it's successful approaches. Realistically, if you want to have a program of work and you want to call two-factor authentication JIM, some of the other people in your organization know what JIM is and know how to deal with JIM. Who cares what the name is? You just need to engage with people in a way that relates and is actually something that they will do something about. It doesn't matter what it's called. It's the fact that they perform the behavior that you want them to do. And I think that gets lost because we get so territorial over having the correct language and believing that there's one sort of behavior, and it becomes a very transactional relationship. In actual fact, the successful approaches are more adaptable and are that agile and openness to the fact that people are different. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I mean, Phoebe, if you were to call things, common language like two-factor authentication, and call them JIM and everybody understand it, when actually people are faced with actual risk, in their day-to-day, when they're having to make decisions, they've got stress, their boss is probably telling them they've got to deliver it by the end of the day, when they're under that stress, work from people like Daniel Kahneman and behavioral economics suggests that, we have two systems, system one and system two. And, people default to automatic and intuitive processing. So, when you're up against it and you've got an email coming in, you've got to respond, what implication does this have for, the training that we deliver, but also, I guess, the outcomes that we would see?
Yeah, it definitely has implications. As I mentioned earlier, it's something that we really do need to consider in the education that we give. We need to understand these more intuitive or reflex habit type responses, people are going to be under time pressure, people are going to be stressed, people are going to be making decisions quickly. So it's about forming these habits and making security a priority for that person. As Kerry and Imogen have said, making tailored education is really, really key. People are working in really complex environments, and something that we know as psychologists is that people's behaviours are also complex. It's not, they're unpredictable, and we can try to map the factors that influence that behaviour, but it's really difficult, and that's why research is needed for us to be able to unpick the kind of key factors that influence behaviours when faced with risk. There are a few theories that have been pulled from areas like health literature. So protection motivation theory says that we kind of, when we're faced with a risk, we'll appraise that threat. So work out kind of how high or how problematic that threat is. But as well as that, we'll also assess our own coping mechanism. So, okay, how do I know how to address this threat? Am I confident in doing that? And actually that aspect has been shown to be even more important. So making sure that we address people's confidence and making sure people have got the skills to approach threat can really have an impact on how people make decisions when faced with risk.
Okay, and to just follow on from that, Phoebe, I mean, so from the research that you're doing, I mean, what should organisations focus on to tackle the people component? So if we were to say, right, you know, this is an important area, we need to tackle it. What do you think are the key things that organisations should focus on?
Yeah, I do think there are a few things because I think we need a holistic approach. So as I said previously, we need more research, we need some more about how humans are making decisions, which behaviours are more problematic within an organisation, so creating those metrics. These are really crucial for black box thinking, so be able to pull apart a problem after it's happened. Making sure that human-machine interfaces are accepted by staff. So the acceptance of new technologies is really key. And as technology is moving at such a fast pace, this is really something that organisations need to think about. So how humans team with AI and work with machines. I also think that organisations need to be aware of something called fundamental attribution error. So this idea of othering, I think Kerry mentioned it earlier, that often if something goes wrong, somebody will blame somebody else. So, oh, that's IT's fault, or the IT department will say, oh, that's the users, that's their problem, that's their fault, they're kind of stupid. So really trying to focus on bringing everybody together and creating a culture of kind of everybody's in it, personal responsibility and autonomy, rather than kind of making the problem move around your organisation.
Okay, great, thank you. And so, Kerry, on that note, so if we are, you know, trying to tackle the people component, how important? I mean, because you said there's, you know, there's obviously hard measures, and then you talked about qualitative measures. How important is it for organisations to start collecting this data and start measuring, I guess, you know, what risk looks like for them before they can start it, or could they potentially just tackle the people component without measuring and understanding the risks that people pose?
Yeah, so yeah, they could. I mean, there's no harm in starting, but the danger then becomes is how do you show change? One of the things in organisations that they want you to prove is that oddly, dealing with people is worthwhile. You can buy technology, you can spend loads of money on technology. You don't really know it's doing something. I mean, you don't really truly know what it's completely doing or how useful it's going to be, but that seems to be an easier measurement for people to gain because you have a box, you have something that creates some sort of logging or what have you that they can stick in a folder and never look at. But that's generally considered a fine measurement. But then when it comes to people, because we are all people, everybody thinks that if you do it in a particular way, then of course it's common sense. So why would I need to do it in that way? I already know as a human being who works in this organisation how people will behave, or this or that. So there seems to be less of an endeavour to approach it more strategically, and to create that strategy over time. And so what that does then is that means that vital point at the beginning where things have already happened, you can never baseline to the original point, which is often what you look for when you're doing science, but you can at least have a marker in the ground of, actually, this is where we consider the change is going to go from, so you can start there, and do some sort of baselining, collecting data that you already have, as Imogen has spoken about, that already exists in the organisation. You don't need to go out and recreate loads of data. You can just look for what's already there, see what it's already telling you, and then build from it, and also be very conscious of who that data then is for and who the measurements are for. So the data within an organisation to do with risk isn't really often for security people, it's for compliance people, it's for audit people, it's for security people, it's for board people. So they all have different needs and they all have different wants, and it does make it very, very hard. But I've been to many presentations, because there's a series of research going on about how do you get messages across the board, how do you get them to pay attention to cybersecurity, for example. And one of the things that has come across in that more than anything in that research, and the talks that I've been to, is that they like stories to be told. So yes, they appreciate the data, of course, because they'll probably all come from a finance background or whatever, or some accountancy or whatever that they have. But nothing rings true more than a story of how things work in practice, of actually, even though there's this and this, this is the feedback that we get. And in my previous work, one of the seniors in the organisation said to me once, they'd forgotten something, and they'd got an email back from the IT department, which was really, really actually quite mean, he said to me. And so he said, once I'd experienced having that email, I realised everybody else having this email, it's not really putting them in the best mindset to start off with. So how are we really engaging with people, and how are we really allowing that sort of support nature to come across if we're just telling people off? So you can have that engagement level, like through your and measurement through your IT support, but if you then start changing, say for example, the way that you communicate with people, how do they answer, the way that they answer, doing that sort of analysis on, do they need your answer anymore? They might not ask any more questions because you've probably written a very nice email that they don't need to deal with anymore. And then not being afraid to ask, and having that honest conversation about really what does it mean. But you do always have to bear in mind that, unfortunately, the people who do compliance and audit are working from places that are often relatively older, that say, for example, I read one of the compliance documents the other day, and the password guidance is actually quite old compared to where the industry is going. So how do you have that balance? And how do you communicate that balance? And how can you have legitimate conversations with those groups of people as well, to show that you're moving forward, that you have, yes, these measurements, but by trying these other things, that they will hopefully better themselves, and it will lower the risk. But you have to try. You can't be stuck, and you can't just not do anything, because realistically the space has never really got much better over the last 20 years. So there's no harm in trying, right? I mean, like I said, the organizations aren't dying all of the time. Okay. So it's about pushing that boundary and being able to gently push that boundary in the right way, to compromise with multiple different stakeholders, which is what makes this sort of area very complex, because it's not only the staff that you deal with, it's all of the other people and the expectations of all of the others in the organisation of what security is to them. And that's a very much a compromise and balancing act.
Okay, and in terms of, just follow on question there, Kerry, in terms of like security teams, if they were to go and measure how effective, I guess, like you said, their communication is, what do you think is the best way? Is it just observing that people are behaving safely, or do you think asking softer questions of, are people happy with the communication they receive? Do they understand it? That kind of stuff. Is that more effective? Well,
if you ask people, are you happy? They're likely to say yes, because most people are very agreeable to you. And you'll always get people that then will say no because they're not agreeable, because you have a subset of people who will, basically, because they want to get their day job done. They don't want to have it interrupted. They're just going to become agreeable and what have you. And again, you can do surveys, you can gauge understanding over time. But again, if you're going to do a survey, there's no point doing it in that one moment. You have to then do it over probably over a year easily, to gather that data over the time to see if it actually does change. Doing it in that one moment won't show you that much, because you've changed something, they've noticed a change, and then they'll react to the change in a positive way, because most people initially notice it. So the fact that they've noticed it doesn't mean that it's gone well. They've just noticed it's happened and told you, oh yeah, that did change, that's interesting. So it's about that ongoing nature, and so planning for that ongoingness is, like I said, it is hard, and you do have to think about it. Surveys have to be asked in particular ways, the way you phrase questions and what have you, if you're going to do it that way. Or you could start, a lot of organizations have like security champions, where they have particularly people of interest who are interested in cybersecurity across the organization, who will then be that person, so you don't have to do it, because obviously a security team may only be 10 people, they can't go across an entire organization. So how do you use the people within your organization to garner that information for you? And that's about creating community, and that's about creating this is by helping us, we're helping you, and that camaraderie around security, that we can do better, we can be better, and we can do this as a partnership, instead of me just telling you what to do. Okay, excellent. Imogen, so I mean, obviously in Vodafone, you guys seem to be quite ahead in terms of measuring, understanding risk and the risk that humans pose. But how do you think organisations should address the people component if they can't quantify it? Well, what are the steps they should take to get to where I guess Vodafone is?
I mean, I think every business should be able to quantify it, because the way technology is just start simple. First of all, break your teams down into different groups, even if that just means simply the technical side, the non-technical side. And then start looking at what you have got in terms of data to start do that quantification. Now, if they really absolutely can't do it, then it's all about, as I think Sarah mentioned it earlier, it's about building networks. It's about getting points of contact across those various teams, engaging with them, understanding their issues, understanding the different risks that the teams have, and start to ask them what it is that they need, what's the problem. Because if you don't map the risk and if you don't engage, then you're blind really to treat what's happening. And so if you absolutely can't measure it, maybe because of, I don't know, certain regulations around what data you can track of employees, then you've got to get personal. And another thing that we're building is a network of security champions. And so when we're doing a lot of online workshops at the moment, and pretty much after every workshop, we're picking up an individual from each team. So we recently did it with the finance teams that said, hey, I'm really interested in this. Can you send me direct your products? Because not everyone goes on Workplace. And then what they do is they start sharing it. And so by building that network and building that personal relationship, it's going to become much easier for us to directly engage with employees in a way that we can't at the moment. Because probably like most businesses, we have quite strict controls over what can be shared over the communication space. So sending emails to every employee 99% of the time isn't possible. And so we put it on Workplace. Problem with Workplace is that only those people that are interested in something see it. And so doing that, I call it the shadow network. So having our points of contact, non-security people, but security champions across the business, will in the longer term make a massive difference when we come to engaging. But building that network of security champions is tricky, because to make it work, you need people that really want to be part of that network. And so that's a slow burner. We're making progress. We're probably picking up 2 new champions a month, but in a year's time, it will pay huge dividends. So that's what you need to do, is engage. But you've got to engage personally. You've got to make it personal, and you've got to show real interest. Otherwise, why should anyone want to engage with you?
Absolutely, yeah. Otherwise, they'll just think it's a generic email sent out to everyone wanting people to get involved. Okay, thank you to my panels. Before we go on to the next section where we take questions from the audience, I think we were going to share the results of our poll. So the poll questions that we were really looking at was around, do people think that, what the biggest barriers to tackling, sorry, the first one was, are you looking at to improve the way your organisation manages human risk? Could we go to the next question? I think the next one was more interesting, to see what people are saying. Britt, are you? Or is it scroll down? Oh no, sorry, it is there. Sorry. Okay. So actually, it's quite a split. So we had a few options and then none of the above. About a third of people said none of the above, but about a third of the people said it's too hard to change human behaviour. Human risk management is too complex. About a quarter of the people did say people are part of the problem and users won't listen. And then we had a small percentage say the best solution is to deploy more technical security measures and lock things down. And this is quite interesting because one of the, so we've had a few questions, and one of the themes, I guess, on those questions is, and I'm going to pose it to everyone, is it easier just to take people out of the process and just deploy more security controls in place? I'll go to Kerry first on that, because, you know, from your experience, Kerry, in looking at this.
Well, no, because people are always part of the process. I mean, people build the technology, people implement the technology, people design and code the technology. So at some point, there's going to be a security flaw. There's going to be a security problem with the way that it's configured, mainly because that's often what the security flaws are. It's not that somebody clicks on a link or this or that. There are loads of different places. There are loads of little elements of where those incidents happen, and it's about that chain of incident management, really. And so you can't take any person out, because if you're not doing it for people, then what's the point of doing anything? Organizations are built of people to create whatever the organization is doing. Often they just build organizations to make money. So if you're not doing it for that purpose, then why would you have an organization with a security issue at all?
Absolutely. Imogen, what's your opinion on just deploying more security controls as opposed to, you know, dealing with people? Because you obviously talk about, you know, engaging and being personal.
I'd argue that some engagement is actually a control. You know,
Right.
actually doing the workshops, we identify the risk, the gap. One of the risks we have is a gap in people's knowledge. They've done their training, we've pushed out all the articles, but they still don't understand, say, what MFA is, or they don't understand well how to identify phishing links. So the controls that we're putting in is engaging on a personal level with the workshops. Yes, it's hard work, but you don't need to do workshops with every employee. If you've got a smattering of people across a team, what happens is then those employees that have done the workshops, they've got the knowledge. They then share it across their small team. So I think when we talk about controls, you all think control has to be technical, but actually a control can be very much people orientated. But going back to the whole point of this discussion is changing people's behavior and getting people to engage is difficult, because we all have our fixed habits and our fixed beliefs and our fixed outlook on life. And getting under that skin and changing people's beliefs is incredibly difficult. But I tie into what Kerry was saying earlier about storytelling. We now put storytelling into literally everything we do. We did a professional workshop on it a few weeks ago, and that has made a massive difference, because human beings learn through stories. And you mentioned if you give an exco just data, they're not interested, but if you turn it into a story, they'll listen and they'll engage. And so I think storytelling, bringing that in, is a really valuable piece, and will make some of your controls definitely more effective, but controls aren't just technical.
Thank you. And Phoebe, from your point of view, obviously from a cyber psychology point of view, we do know that, you know, that there are certain elements where people build habits, or, you know, certain behaviors just go against how we naturally behave. And, you know, you see, you know, in the real world where we social engineer stuff like roads, for example, we have speed humps, because we just know that people will, if they see a flat, straight road and it's empty, they'll just speed, you know, maybe conscious, maybe unconscious, we have speed humps. You know, are there things, I think, you know, that would be better taking out of people, I guess, taking people out? Would there be areas where, you know, you just feel that the way humans behave is not going to change?
I think that, as Kerry said, I think humans are always part of the equation, and you need to consider both. Technical controls are really, really important, but humans themselves are targeted by malicious actors.
Social engineering.
And exactly, so it's the controls are being explored for humans. There's something that we shouldn't just throw away as, oh, that's impossible. Humans are flexible. It's one of our kind of greatest traits, is that we can adapt, we can learn. It's just about doing it in the right way. As Imogen said, becoming drawing techniques from other areas that are kind of a bit further along. So as I've said before, persuasion techniques used in healthcare, narrative techniques used in education, using all of this rather than kind of sticking with this kind of a drier technology way of talking about things is really, really key, and definitely not something that we should not attempt.
Okay, and just sticking with you, another theme of the questions is, always hot topic, which is using AI and machine learning. I mean, what do you think the role is? Obviously, a lot of companies look at AI and machine learning and think they can just use it to, I guess, mitigate risk, to just put AI in place so that if someone does something risky, the AI will take over and protect them. Well, what do you think the role of AI and machine learning is in security?
Well, I think it's always evolving. I mean, at the moment, it's only just starting out. So it'll be, at the moment, it's mainly used to flag up things to emergency response teams and IT departments. So if there's kind of behaviour that's not usually seen, patterns of behaviour that seem odd. So even though AI is being used, the results are being shown to a human. So we need to have systems in place that mean that those IT teams or those users understand what the AI is telling them, why they've come to that conclusion, and what to do about it. So AI does have a really important role because it can go through data really, really quickly, but there are certain things that AI doesn't have capabilities to do yet. So we're much more flexible thinking. We can look at case by case problems and kind of have a bit more insight sometimes into what might be happening. So it's really important that we work together. So there's a lot of research around explainable AI and trust. So this is a really, really important area of research. And again, if we are using new technologies or AI with staff members, it's important to chat with staff members and try to get a feel of where they may be unsure about what an AI is doing, or where they may need more support in working and teaming with that type of technology.
Okay. Imogen, what's your view on using AI within organisations like Vodafone? Will it help make people less risky, or did you think it's just a red herring?
I don't think it can. No, not at all. I don't think it can necessarily make people less risky, but if you've got a large enough data set over a long enough time span, it can start to hopefully pick up on the indicators that maybe suggest an employee is going in a direction that then is going to present risk. Because human beings set habits. Human beings will set habits, will follow trends. And I think if you had very good AI that had the right data sources, you can start to map an employee's behaviour over time. So maybe they start off with a few little DLP things and there's a little bit of shadow IT. And then over time, as they get more confident with what they're doing, it starts to escalate to a level then when it becomes a risk. But if you had a good IT AI system that had that baseline, that could pick up on the presence of the abnormal and the absence of the normal, you can start to identify those employees that you need to engage with at the earliest onset. What you don't want is an employee that has to go all the way through, have a serious breach of some nature, and then you engage with them. So I think with the right data sets and with the right algorithms, AI can be incredibly valuable at building that baseline. And that's actually something we did suggest to one of our suppliers, at how we could do that. And they said, oh, we're not there yet. But that's what I'm intrigued in. So it's not monitoring employees, it's having a clever system that picks up on the anomaly and then you personally engage.
Okay. And finally, Kerry, to you. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion around culture as well. And obviously with technologies like AI and machine learning, how do you think companies should approach that without employees feeling as though they're being monitored by some kind of robot or something?
Well, a part of the way is about how do you talk about it, and it's to start with. Actually, a lot of the machine learning can, instead of being aimed at the person, is to automate things so they can recognize particular, say, sorts of emails to do with phishing and what have you. So there's less getting through to people. So you take what you can automate. And you look to actually, instead of having somebody needing to click on this link or click on this thing every 2 hours, do they need to? Is there a way to automate that process? Is there a way to automate a particular, especially like low-level stuff? So you aren't expecting people to do more of those menial tasks that interrupt their day, because that creates a distraction. And as soon as you've got a distraction, then they're not concentrating as much and what have you. So can machine learning and AI be used for that sort of sense as well. So yes, of course, if you're monitoring people, there is a pushback against that. There's pushback against phishing training, where there's loads of complaints about it being called entrapment because you're forcing people to fail, and people don't like it. So I can imagine that's definitely the direction that if you're doing that with AI or picking those things apart. And of course, there's always the element when you're working with these things of revocation. So for example, I watched the Panorama documentary yesterday about the post office. And the idea that that system couldn't fail. And so these people went to prison, when in actual fact systems can fail. And we have to acknowledge the fact that these things aren't always correct. And how do you make sure that it isn't completely away from a person's control, that they have the right to answer back, and that is taken seriously. So to make sure that that support feature is fully there, and understanding who's responsible, who's accountable, and to be clear about what you can do about that, and that there is a real chain of authority that is not about then pushing blame for doing something or assuming that somebody's going to do something or whatever, that actually there are things that you can do about it, so people can understand why it's there, where it fits, and what they can do about it if they feel they're being perhaps victimized, because that has happened. I mean, it's not like it's not happening. I mean, if you've interested in reading anything, there's the book called Weapons of Mass Destruction, which I highly recommend, which talks about this problem.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of my guests. We have run out of time. In fact, we're over time. Thank you so much. It's been a very interesting discussion. I'd also like to thank thank the audience for who attended. Thank you very much. And like I said, we are holding these sort of webinars every month, and they're related to a sort of human-centered approach to security, a framework we're developing. So if any of the audience would like to get involved, please do reach out. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed this fruitful discussion, and hope to see you next month. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, Shawful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.